The fighter pilot could not see the river, only the black void where the odor wound through the ruins below. What he did see was far worse. Filling his windscreen was the blunt nose of a bomber with no cockpit, just a smooth metal cone that hid almost 4 tons of explosives. The whole contraption shuddered as flak bursts stepped closer, white flashes beating against the glass. The pilot's FW-190 rode on top of the bomber like a parasite, locked to it by steel struts. Any sudden movement, any wrong control input, and the two aircraft would tear each other apart. Beneath him, the mutilated Junkers Ju-88 carried a warhead designed to punch through 7 meters of concrete and turn a bridge span into flying scrap. Tonight, it was aimed at the Soviet crossings at Kustrin. If those bridges held, the Red Army would pour across the Oder and cut what was left of Germany in half. The pilot, Lieutenant Eckhard Dittmann of the Secchi KG-200, kept his eyes on the faint glow that marked the bridgehead ahead. Searchlights probed the clouds, hunting the intruders. Somewhere below, Soviet gunners were already firing blindly. The arcs of tracer climbed toward the sound of engines. Dittmann's instruments shook as flak fragments tore through the air. He still had to guide this monstrous pair to precisely the right angle, release the bomber at the exact second, then pull his fighter free before the explosive-laden Ju-88 plunged toward the bridge. It was like trying to ride a runaway horse while sitting on a live torpedo. One wrong move, and the Frankenstein bomber below him would take him along when it died. It was April 27, 1945. Berlin was less than a week from encirclement. On paper, the Luftwaffe's secret missile unit still possessed a weapon that could blow open harbors, smash dams, or, in a grand plan drawn up 2 years earlier, cripple the power grid that fed Soviet industry. In reality, Dittmann and his 6 fellow crews were making one of the last, doomed attempts to use that weapon as intended. The strange double aircraft beneath him was the end point of a desperate idea. Bolt a fighter on top of a retired bomber, rip out the bomber's cockpit, replace it with a gigantic-shaped charge, and send the unmanned lower half into hardened targets, while the fighter pilot flew it from above. It was half aircraft, half guided missile, a flying experiment in standoff destruction. The story of how Germany built this parasitic bomber, and how it nearly became the key to a plan to switch off Soviet industry, begins not at the Oder in 1945, but 3 years earlier, when the Luftwaffe still believed it could bend the war back in its favor through sheer ingenuity. In 1942, German planners faced a hard truth. They did not have a true 4-engine heavy bomber fleet like the RAF or US-ADF. Their twin-engine Ju-88s and He-111s could carry respectable bomb loads, but against thick concrete pens, dry docks, and warships, conventional bombs often did little more than chip the paint. At the same time, many early war bombers were being worn out by endless operations. Instead of scrapping them, some engineers saw a different fate. What if those tired airframes became one-way weapons, carrying a single enormous warhead that no conventional bomber could lift, guided close to the target by a pilot who stayed safely in a small aircraft on top? Experiments had already been made with piggyback combinations using gliders and light aircraft. Test pilots joked about father and son combinations with a small fighter perched on a larger machine. Now the concept was pushed further. Junkers Ju-88 bomber airframes, stripped of unnecessary equipment, had their glazed noses cut away and replaced by a blunt metal cone filled with a hollow charge warhead weighing around 3,500 kilograms, more than some entire fighter aircraft. The warhead's liner would focus the explosive energy into a high-velocity jet capable of boring into reinforced concrete and armor plate in ways ordinary bombs could not. On top of this mutilated bomber, engineers bolted a Messerschmitt Bf-109, or later, a Focke-Wulf FW-190, connected by a forest of steel struts. Cables and control lines ran from the fighter's cockpit down into the bomber's systems. From his seat in the upper aircraft, the pilot could control both sets of engines and the bomber's control surfaces, effectively flying a giant two-story machine. At the chosen moment, he would aim the pair at the target, arm the warhead, then trigger explosive bolts in the struts. The fighter would leap free. The bomber would continue on its last dive, guided only by inertia and the pilot's final trim input. The first test flights at Rechlin in 1943 were nerve-wracking affairs. Pilots described the sensation of takeoff as being pushed along by a sluggish, drunken giant. The combined weight of fighter and bomber could reach nearly 20 tons, demanding long runways and perfect coordination from both engines. Once airborne, the composite aircraft responded slowly, wallowing through turns and climbs. Separation tests were the most dangerous. A moment's delay, or a slight mistrim, and the fighter could slam back into the bomber's tail, or be caught in the shock wave of the explosion. One of the test pilots, a young officer who would later join KG-200, recalled years afterward how he eased his Bf-109 clear of the Ju-88 and watched with held breath as the bomber, now nothing but a huge flying bomb, glided on down toward the target range. The warhead struck a concrete block meant to represent a battleship's armored belt. When the smoke cleared, the block was simply gone, replaced by a jagged crater. The shaped charge had focused its energy into a narrow jet that punched deep into the target before detonating, scattering chunks of reinforced concrete like gravel. The demonstration impressed the observers from the Air Ministry. Here, they believed, was a way to sink ships in heavily defended anchorages or to knock out hardened installations without sacrificing crews. The project received a code name that sounded almost whimsical: Mistel, the German word for mistletoe, a parasitic plant that clings to a host tree. Behind the playful name lurked a far more sinister nickname: Beethoven device. If it worked, planners dreamed of using it like an orchestra's hammer blow, a single devastating strike against a vital target. By mid-1944, the first operational Mistel combinations, Ju-88 bombers fitted with warheads and Bf-109 or FW-190 fighters on top, were delivered to 2 KG-101, a unit associated with the Luftwaffe's Special Operations Wing. The original ambition was bold. Hermann Göring and his staff wanted to send these Frankenstein bombers against the Royal Navy's home fleet at Scapa Flow in the Orkney Islands, hoping for a surprise blow that would echo the earlier U-boat penetration of the anchorage. The operation carried the code name Drachenhöhle, Dragon's Lair, and pilots trained on detailed models of the harbor, plotting approach routes low over the North Sea. But history refused to cooperate. Before the Mistel force was ready, the war swung west. In June 1944, Allied troops stormed ashore in Normandy. Suddenly, every aircraft that could possibly threaten the invasion fleet was needed in the Channel. The Mistel unit was diverted south, its carefully crafted plans for a long-range raid on Scapa Flow shelved in favor of a more immediate, if less glamorous, target: the crowded lanes of ships off the French coast. On the night of June 24-25, 1944, Mistels flew their combat debut over the Bay of the Seine. The pilots approached at low level, heavy with fuel and explosives. One pair was spotted by a Royal Canadian Air Force Mosquito night fighter. The Canadian pilot, seeing what looked like a bomber carrying another aircraft on its back, needed a moment to grasp what he was looking at. Then he closed in and opened fire. The combined aircraft, described later as lumbering and easy to hit, broke apart and exploded in a vast flash as the warhead detonated in the air. Other missiles slipped through the defenses. One guided bomber narrowly missed a block ship used to help form the artificial Mulberry harbors. Another exploded near the frigate HMS Nith, showering the vessel with shrapnel, killing several crewmen, and forcing the damaged ship to be towed back to England. The blast impressed everyone who saw it, yet in terms of strategic effect, the results were meager. No major warship was sunk, no harbor rendered unusable. Flying the Mistral had proven at least as dangerous to its own crews as to the enemy. The composite aircraft's vast weight and sluggish handling made it vulnerable during the climb and approach. Allied fighters hunting over France and the North Sea soon learned to recognize the silhouette of the piggyback bombers. In February 1945, P-51 Mustang pilots from the USAAF intercepted a flight of Mistrals being repositioned for the Scapa Flow plan. The American pilots later described how they attacked the formations, aiming first for the fighters on top. With the control aircraft gone, the Ju-88s below lumbered on aimlessly before diving into the ground or being finished off. Despite these losses and limited successes, the most ambitious role imagined for the Mistral lay thousands of kilometers to the east. By late 1943, German planners were increasingly obsessed with finding some way, any way, to strike directly at the Soviet industrial machine that was outproducing them in tanks, guns, and aircraft. Professor Heinrich Steinmann of the Reich Air Ministry proposed an operation with a suitably heavy name: Eisenhammer, Iron Hammer. The idea was chilling in its simplicity. Rather than trying to bomb dozens of factories, the Luftwaffe would attack the power stations that fed them, destroy the hydroelectric and steam plants around Moscow and Gorky, he argued, and as much as 3/4 of the electricity used by Soviet armament works would vanish. Traditional bombers might shatter windows and damage machinery, but the crucial turbines sat behind thick walls and under reservoirs of water. The Mistral warhead, able to drill through meters of concrete, seemed tailor-made for such targets. Planning conferences were held where pilots and navigators pored over aerial photographs, maps, and even scale models of the power plants. Each station was assigned 4 to 6 Mistral combinations. The crews rehearsed low-level routes that would take them across the front lines at night, then deep into Soviet territory to strike the vulnerable turbines. If Eisenhammer had been carried out as planned, dozens of piggyback bombers would have crossed the front on a single night, each one a flying-shaped charge aimed at a different node of the Soviet electrical grid. For a brief moment on paper, it looked as if this strange weapon might truly cut Europe in half, plunging the Western Soviet Union into darkness and halting the flow of T-34s and Yak fighters. But the plan never left the briefing rooms. By the time sufficient Mistral airframes and trained crews were available, the front had shifted. Soviet air defenses were no longer weak. The Luftwaffe no longer controlled the skies, even at night. Fuel shortages, overstretched units, and the need to respond to Allied pressure in the West all conspired to postpone Eisenhammer again and again. By early 1945, with the Red Army advancing into Germany itself, the concept of flying lumbering bomber-fighter combinations hundreds of kilometers into enemy territory had become fantasy. Instead, the Mistral would be used for a much more immediate and much more desperate task, trying to demolish the bridges over which that Red Army was advancing. That was how Lieutenant Dittmann found himself on top of a live warhead over the Oder. KG-200's Mistral component, now organized as 6-pointer KG-200 with training elements attached, was ordered to throw its remaining aircraft against the crossings at Kustrin and other bridgeheads on the Oder and Neisse rivers. On paper, the shaped charges were more than capable of shredding a bridge span. In practice, The combination of dense Soviet anti-aircraft fire, smoke screens, and the inherent clumsiness of the Mistel made success unlikely. On April 27th, 7 Mistel combinations lifted off from Verneuken, east of Berlin, escorted by single-seat FW-190s. The climb-out was punishing. One crew had to jettison their bomber prematurely. As they approached the front, Soviet searchlights pinned the formations and a wall of flak rose to meet them. One composite after another was hit. Some separated early, their fighter components diving away as burning Ju-88 shells spiraled down in premature, futile explosions. Others were torn apart outright. Of the 7, only 2 Meistels reached the target area in any condition to attack. Dittmann's was one of them. In his later account, he described lining up on what he believed to be the bridge amid smoke and chaos. He trimmed carefully, released the Ju-88, and yanked his FW-190 up and away as the bomber dropped. A gliding torpedo aimed at the shadowed span. A moment later, a blinding flash reached up toward him, the shock wave kicking his fighter like a toy. When his vision cleared, the river was still there, the bridge still standing. The blast had done damage. Some planks, perhaps one span, but not enough to sever the crossing. Soviet engineers would repair it in hours. Only 2 of the control fighters returned to base that night. The rest, like their bomber halves, had been swallowed by the inferno at the front. Subsequent Mistel raids against other Oder bridges fared no better. Some warheads detonated harmlessly in riverbanks. Others were shot down before they could be released. The shaped charge, so impressive at the test range, could do little if it never reached the exact point on the target it needed. By the end of April, the last Mistel airframes had been expended or destroyed on the ground. KG-200 surviving pilots were sent to fly conventional fighters in the chaotic final battles over Germany. Seen from the Allied side, the Mistel often appeared more curious than terrifying. Ground troops who stumbled across abandoned composites in 1945 described them as grotesque. A fighter perched on a bomber whose nose had been replaced by a sinister cone, like a beak on a headless bird. Photographs taken at airfields in Denmark and Germany showed these combinations tucked among trees or parked at the edge of fields, waiting for missions that never came. Pilots who fought them remembered them as easy victims when caught in the air. The Mustang pilots who intercepted the Scapa flow-bound group noted that the massive piggyback machines could barely maneuver, and once the upper fighter was damaged, the entire combination was doomed. Yet it would be unfair to dismiss the Mistel purely as a failure. In concept, it was one of the earliest attempts to solve a problem that would dominate post-war air warfare: how to deliver a large warhead onto a heavily defended point target without losing a crew in the process. The Mistel's crude, man-guided approach foreshadowed later standoff weapons and guided missiles. Its shaped charge was a direct ancestor of the warheads used in modern bunker-buster munitions. When engineers after the war studied German developments, they found in the Mistel not a workable weapon for the future, but an early, desperate step toward one. For the men who flew it, however, abstraction meant little. What they remembered was the feeling of sitting atop a bomb big enough to vaporize them instantly. The long, tense takeoffs, the way the struts groaned and flexed in turbulence. They recalled the strange silence after separation when the loud, dragging presence beneath them suddenly vanished, and their fighter leaped forward, suddenly light and agile again, if they had judged their timing correctly. The Mistel never cut Europe's power grid, never sank a battleship in a secure anchorage, never turned the tide at the Oder. Of some 250 composite aircraft built, only a handful ever reached their targets, and fewer still achieved meaningful damage to enemy infrastructure. Yet its story reveals something essential about the late Luftwaffe. Faced with overwhelming industrial and numerical odds, German planners turned to increasingly strange hybrid creations, hoping that cleverness could compensate for a shrinking war economy. They grafted fighters onto bombers, strapped rockets to gliders, and designed manned versions of missiles, oscillating between the desire to save pilots and the willingness to sacrifice them in one-way attacks. The Mistel sat precisely on that line, a suicide weapon without the suicide, asking its crews to ride into the most dangerous part of a mission and then somehow escape. After the war, most surviving composites were scrapped where they stood. A few top-mounted fighters were taken as trophies. One FW-190 that once sat atop a Ju-88 Mistel ended up in a British museum, its attachment fitting still visible under the paint. The Ju-88 lower halves, little more than reused airframes with their noses blown open, vanished back into the scrap metal from which they had been built. For decades, the Mistel remained a footnote, a curiosity in photos, a reminder of how strange the air war had become in its final years. Yet when modern viewers look at those photographs, the fighter straddling the bomber, the massive warhead in place of a cockpit, they sense intuitively why Allied pilots and ground crews called it a Frankenstein bomber. It was a machine built from leftovers and desperation, stitched together in the hope that one more shock weapon could change a war that was already lost. It failed at that task, but in failing, it pointed toward a future where pilots would increasingly guide weapons rather than be part of them, where the line between aircraft and missile would blur. On that April night over the Oder, as Dittmann turned for home through the burning sky, he could not know any of this. All he knew was that his squadron's last throw had missed, that the bridges were still standing, and that the river beneath him was filling with Soviet pontoon crossings. The Mistel had tried to cut Europe in half. In the end, it merely marked the point at which Germany's ambitions, like its hybrid bombers, finally ran out of lift.